Welcome to Inside Games, the only gaming news channel brave enough to preview The Outer Worlds 2, to throw us back into space, working for the Space Megacorps. I got to play this at Summer Game Fest. Microsoft threw a little preview event, so thanks Xbox for inviting us out. I have to say right away, my top-of-the-line takeaway, as soon as I sat down and started playing it, this game's shooter feel is so much better than Outer Worlds 1, and just in general, presentationally, it's so much more AAA. Like it feels like a big budget action RPG shooter to the extent where I was like, this kind of feels like Cyberpunk. Like it feels like a you can play it as a run and gun now, whereas I feel like you couldn't do that with Outer Worlds 1. Now some caveats, I was given a character with a particular build. And even though that build wasn't very combat intensive, I had this fire rifle and I had a freezy icy shotgun, which I think kind of speaks to the modability of some of the weapons, but like even the gun models were crazy high polygon, the reload animations were really cool looking, the guns themselves were crazy detailed and kind of, you know, like had their own mechanical flair. So it's the things like that where I'm like, wow, they really blew the lid off the production for this. They really ramped up the scope of this game just in terms of the quality of the assets and things like that.
So I have to ask you, did it feel anything like New Vegas? Because obviously New Vegas has great shooting because of the basis of Fallout 3, but even then they're pretty old games. And I think that Obsidian has really improved. Avowed, I think, was a good example of a game that their magic and their shooting was pretty solid. And the elemental stuff that you just described as well was also really cool. So better than Avowed? Better than New Vegas?
Way better than New Vegas. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because to me, The Outer Worlds 1 did feel kind of more like maybe that old Bethesda experience, old console shooter experience. Where there's maybe a slight delay on the inputs, the reticle is like very locked to the center of the screen, the guns are kind of there and unmoving, and you can like, it just feels disconnected, you know, you shoot and maybe some frames later something happens, enemies kind of run around weirdly. No, this, like I said, this feels more akin to something like Cyberpunk, which, yeah, after playing Avowed, I guess that should have been more of a hint that they were really like barreling in on game feel, because that game had a very pulpy kind of arcadey sensibility to how the combat worked. And I think they've applied that to the Outer Worlds now, just in terms of gunplay. Even though there were some melee weapons, you know, you can get a sneak attack from behind with a melee weapon. But what I found is just the guns, man, they just shredded everything. Maybe I had overpowered guns, but even still, it did feel like here's an example. I had a rifle where when I looked down the scope, it would actually like lock on to targets. And then if I pulled the trigger, it would just shoot them. So I think what they want to do with that, I'm sure there are still skill-based shooting weapons, but I think they wanted to provide an experience where if you just wanted to 0 IQ shoot everything and level up, it's a lot more welcoming of that. I was inside of this, for the demo, I was inside of this like, you know, lab, I guess, for lack of a better word. I'm not quite sure of the context there. The micro story that was happening in that environment is there's like a scientist who had been sabotaged, essentially. She had tried to do this experiment. The security guard that had career ambitions and didn't like her had sabotaged the experiment. So then I would go through all these rooms filled with just like rank and file goons that were fun to shoot, but just in terms of the tone of the game, you know, there's just like dudes with red bars over them that you just like eviscerate. There were still RPG checks happening though. And again, I think immediately I just kept making comparisons to Cyberpunk where, you know, there might be a line of dialogue that I didn't have the right skill to choose, but it would appear there, showing me that, you know, there was an option that another character build could have engaged with. For me, I got to like the scene where this science experiment had happened, and there were certain things that I wasn't allowed to investigate or realizations I wasn't allowed to come to because I didn't have a high enough skill. So I like that not only there are skills to spend points on, but also the game will tell you when there is something you could have done. I think this is something Avowed is pretty good at as well. So you not only feel like, okay, I'm getting to do the things I spec for, but there are things I could have done, you know, with a different character spec or anything like that. So in that way, I think they do evoke Outer Worlds 1 quite well. I'm just curious what this is going to feel like in the end, because I chatted with the developers briefly after the demo. It was a pretty quick demo, all told, or maybe time just flew because it was genuinely fun to play. And they, like, off the top insisted this was an RPG first experience, which when I hear that, I'm used to hearing something that's a little slower, maybe more cerebral, disconnected from combat. But what I experienced was, yeah, a game where it is just fun to like brain off, shoot a ton of enemies. But then, you know, there's also dialogue trees and quirky characters to have conversations with. The scientist was interesting to talk to. I will say that like the general look of the game is extremely again, it's got that AAA aroma about every aspect of it. The character models look really good. Talking to them looks really good. They're not quite so robotic as maybe some old Obsidian or even Bethesda games have been. What hit me also right away is the game is super saturated. Very, very bright pops of intense color, which again is making me think about Cyberpunk a little bit. But, typically, I didn't think Outer Worlds 1 was necessarily all that, saturated, which is not to say it looked bad. But what I read from Outer Worlds 1 is, it is kind of this extrapolation of 1900s trusts from American history. And when I think about that, like 1900s mercantile, I kind of think of, saloons and sepia tone stuff and monotype, whatever. Old yellowed newspapers. And I think a lot of that aesthetic informed Outer Worlds 1. It made sense. Outer Worlds 2 feels like it is 80s neon, up and down. It still has elements of the like brass and steam and steampunk stuff going on. But the aesthetic is far more just like vibrant science fiction, which I think is kind of interesting and probably maybe more generally appealing in terms of aesthetic. But still, if you add it all together, it's not if I had played this, I don't know that I would have guessed it was an Outer Worlds game. Maybe. Not that Outer Worlds 1 necessarily has like super strong aesthetic tentpoles that I'm tied to. But yeah, it like even movement. You move pretty fast, you mantle really fast. You're just slipping and sliding all over the game effortlessly. And effortless movement is not something I typically associate with like older RPGs.
But what you're describing is Avowed. This is Avowed played this way. It was very arcadey. Again, there were guns in the game, I guess, but you mainly used magic, and it was very, very colorful. The shooting was super arcadey. All the describing of mantling and movement and stuff was just like that. You're just sliding everywhere. It didn't matter if you didn't touch the mantle. Your character would go right up. So and I liked Avowed. I think you did too. So it'll be interesting to see if they've improved on that formula from Avowed, or if they literally just wholesale took the Avowed combat system and said, all right, now we'll put it in Outer Worlds.
I don't think like playing Outer Worlds 2 did not feel like playing Avowed, just because when I played Avowed, I did like a heavy melee build, and then I did another run with like magic maybe, but even still magic and Avowed felt a bit different than just the rat-a-tat-tat of like shooting guns in Outer Worlds 2. But I do think Avowed is a really good gut check about the mix of gameplay styles in this game. Cyberpunk and then Avowed are I think both unique in that the second to second is like video game fun. Like you're just shooting and leveling up and everything like that and running around at like crazy speed. What's unique about Avowed and also Cyberpunk for that matter is that the writing is weirdly, adult is the wrong word because it's not all about sex, but it kind of deals with some intense and heady topics. Avowed, I thought, did a pretty good job of it depending on how much you wanted to dive into its, pun intended here, pillars of lore. Because I think that was a complaint that you had, right, Bruce, is that they're just walloping you with like proper nouns and lore references you don't know anything about for the first part of the game.
I just didn't give a shit. Like after a while, they actually did get me to care about the story of the game, but in terms of the lore that surrounded the game, I didn't matter at all. The decisions, though, I thought were pretty cool in the sense that Avowed, I don't know if you got this in your preview for Outer Worlds 2, but in Avowed, there were decisions that you could make that would like literally just cut off an entire city, and you could then no longer go to those cities anymore in Avowed, which I thought was really interesting. And the decisions actually do matter in that game. So I would assume Outer Worlds 2 is probably the same way, but I don't know that. So
I would assume the same as well. It's going to be impossible to know the true scope of variability in the game until we can play it. I will say that like I think the nature of the story that I figured out during the demo, which is essentially here's a human drama, but it's entirely constrained to this environment. Like the story of the scientist that got betrayed so that somebody else could like knock her out of the running for a promotion or something. That is like hyper constrained to that space. So I can see them doing a lot of like stories that have variable outcomes where I either help the scientist or I help the security dude that set her up. But once I do that and leave that environment, then that decision's been made and the consequences of that decision end when I leave that video game dungeon. But still, that's pretty satisfying. That's like it's a healthy and a very responsible way, I think, to make a game that has air quotes branching paths. used to be the term we put on this. But yeah, acknowledging a player decision when it comes to story stuff versus, am I using the rifle or the shotgun today? Which I think this game will also allow, again, in the same way Cyberpunk did. Depending on your difficulty, you can just kind of mow your way through it however you like, even though it provides enough of a character build to give you your playthrough its distinct flavor.
Yeah, I'm super excited for this. I'm glad that you got to play this. I'm really curious to see how long you played it. Was it 30 minutes or was it an hour? Do you remember?
It was like 25 to 30 minutes, I think.
That's not bad.
A handful of that was dialogue, just talking with the NPCs and stuff.
Oh.
There was an amount of shooting people that were just kind of standing in a room. I did appreciate there was some minion banter where it's like I snuck into a room climbing on a vent and two grunts were just kind of shooting the shit about sports. So I'm all about that. I love that stuff. Yeah, it was a pretty even mix of a lot of different stuff. It was shoot some dudes, look around, I lost, I don't know how to go forward. Oh, there's a vent up there. Okay, I'll crawl up into that. So it was kind of trading off, the golden trinity, I guess, of action RPG elements. Shooting guys, picking up loot, climbing into vents, and then talking with people and making soft decisions based on what you say to them.
There's a lot of positive buzz around these previews. A lot of other journalists played this and really enjoyed it. I've been reading a lot of actually really positive articles, people coming out of it being like, wow, the shooting is actually really good in Outer Worlds 2. So I'm glad that you had the same experience. And Lawrence, I'm going to ask the $1 million or the $80 question. Is this game worth $80? Do you think the game's going to be worth $80?
I think for anyone that balks at 80, very few games I think are going to feel like they're okay. That's I think how most people would say yes or no is based on scope, and it's hard to get a feel for that just playing the demo. I do think that they've made the adjustments to make the game a mass market game in the sense that the second to second gameplay is now much more fun than it used to be. And that is a breakthrough that Fallout 3 kind of did. If you go from Fallout 2 to 3, infinitely more people would rather play in first person and actually shoot enemies directly rather than click on a tile on a 2D game from up top and make a bunch of mental decisions about math and probability. So in the same way, I think Outer Worlds 2, it improves the gameplay feel so much that I think people will really enjoy it as just a broadly accessible action RPG. In the same way that I felt like you had said, Avowed could be played as just an arcadey action RPG. You're just running around bonking and leveling up. So in that regard, and again, based on the visual fidelity, because it was a very pretty looking game, from the detailed guns to even the wardrobe on the NPCs. They're not just wearing basic robes. It's these layered different fabrics with different textures and piping on everything, and it looks slick as hell. So I think those are the things that justify it being $80. Playing the game really did surprise me. It is a AAA game, which I didn't think Obsidian would even try to make, but they did, and I think they did a really good job, again, based on the limited experience. So I would say yes, but I'm also pretty permissive of big games getting a little pricier. But if this is I guess ask yourself, if you're worried about $80, would you pay 80 for another attempt at a Cyberpunk style game? I think it's going to be very difficult to hit the level of scope and execution that Cyberpunk did. It's got radio stations that play custom music. Actually, on that note, they did mention a custom radio where it has custom songs for the game. So I was, again, even when the developers were talking about it, I was like, oh my gosh, it's Cyberpunk again. So I love Cyberpunk, and I would have and still probably would now pay $80 for Cyberpunk. So that's me. That's where I'm at. I think if you're an action RPG fan, and if you're starved for a vibrant world to explore, single player RPG game, 80, yeah, probably worth $80 to you. But again, as we always say, Bruce, there's a much easier option. This game will be on Game Pass, and so is Avowed. So if you want a hint at what Outer Worlds might play like, Avowed's right there. I always advise just buy a month of Game Pass, try the games, and see if you like them. It's a pretty cheap way to get a sample of what you're going to potentially buy for. I just stay subscribed to Game Pass, and I don't have a problem with that.
Well, Lawrence, I asked you a very, very hard question, so thank you very much for elaborating. There'd be no way you could tell me it was an $80 game after 30 minutes, so you did your best. And I'm glad that you also mentioned Game Pass, because that's probably the more intelligent way to go about this if you're worried about the $80 price tag. Outer Worlds 2 comes out in October, at the end of October. right around Call of Duty, interestingly. So, so it'll be really interesting to see if Outer Worlds 2 is considered the success that Avowed was. I don't know that Avowed was considered a major success.
We never know.
Yeah,
I guess as long as Obsidian keeps releasing games. Yeah, as a video game enthusiast, I typically like to believe that the games that I like or believe that are well produced find success. Yeah, when it comes to Game Pass games, it's awfully shrouded, isn't it?
It really is. So, I don't know. I think this will get a lot of players for the first month. I think people will end up playing it a lot. I don't know about retail sales, but at least people will play it on Game Pass and enjoy it. I enjoyed Avowed even for its flaws.
And I think Outer Worlds 2 has a better shot, also pun intended. People just like shooters, and people like shooters that are fun to shoot things in. And that was my biggest and most surprising takeaway, is especially compared to Outer Worlds 1. Yeah, the second-to-second shooting feels great. The reloads all look really good. Like, the guns are just fun to have in your hands shooting things, which makes me think that I typically like to play those games a little more cerebrally. At least maybe that's a holdover all the way from old Fallout games. I get a tickle whenever you can solve a conflict with dialogue, and you level up just by saying the right thing. That's the coolest thing in an RPG to me. So I'm a bit conflicted because you can still say things in this game, but shooting feels so good, I might just end up shooting everybody. That's what I ended up doing in Avowed, actually. It broke me out of that. I was like, man, slaughtering things is too fun. I'm just going to pivot into murder mode.
That's what I did too. Thanks, Lawrence. Thanks again for previewing Outer Worlds 2. I'm very jealous.
Hey, my pleasure. Yeah, it was super fun, and the developers were super kind. So yeah, shout outs again to Xbox to inviting us. They didn't give us any free stuff, so there's nothing to disclose. They did take us out to a nice dinner, I guess, that night, so maybe that's connected. But Outer Worlds 2 is still fun to play, and like Bruce said, coming out October. So look forward to it. Thank you once again, Xbox and Obsidian.